The Arizona dawn painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, casting long shadows across the Sonoran desert as Jake Morrison made his way to the stable. His weathered Ariat boots, worn smooth from decades of ranch work, crunched rhythmically on the frost-covered gravel path. The air was crisp and thin at this elevation, carrying the distinctive scent of sage and creosote that always reminded him of home. At 53, Jake had grown accustomed to the profound solitude of ranch life, his only companions the 27 horses and 100 head of cattle that dotted his 1,000-acre spread 30 miles southeast of Tucson. The silence had become his sanctuary over the 4 years since his wife Sarah passed from cancer, broken only by the occasional visit from his neighbor, Tom Rodriguez, or the weekly trip to town for supplies and groceries at the local co-op. Jake had learned to find peace in the routine, feeding the horses at dawn, checking the water tanks, mending fences, and watching the desert transform from the pale gold of morning to the deep purples and reds of sunset. But this morning was different. Something felt off. As Jake approached the weathered wooden stable, built by his grandfather in 1962, he noticed one of the barn cats sitting unusually still by the door, its yellow eyes fixed intently on something inside. The morning chorus of nickering horses seemed more subdued than usual, and Ranger, his oldest gelding, kept turning his massive head toward the far corner of the building. Jake's calloused hand paused on the heavy iron latch. In 30 years of ranching, he'd developed an instinct for trouble, could sense when something was wrong with his animals, when weather was coming, when strangers had been on his land. Right now, every instinct was telling him to be careful. He pushed open the heavy wooden door slowly, the old hinges creaking in protest. The familiar smells of hay, leather, and horses filled his nostrils, but there was something else, something that didn't belong. The morning light filtered through the dusty windows, casting golden beams across the stalls where his horses stood, watching him expectantly. That's when he saw her. There, curled up in a pile of fresh alfalfa hay in the corner behind the feed bins, was a young girl. She couldn't have been more than 16, her long black hair falling like a curtain across her face, her slight frame wrapped in a worn denim jacket that was clearly several sizes too big for her. Her jeans were torn at the knees, and her sneakers, once white but now gray with dust and wear, had holes forming near the toes. She was sleeping so deeply that she didn't stir when Jake entered, and he could see the exhaustion etched in the lines of her face even in sleep. Jake's heart clenched. In all his years on the ranch, he'd never found someone sleeping in his stable. Kids sometimes cut through his property on their way to the swimming hole, and occasionally a hiker would ask for water. But this was different. This girl looked like she'd been running for a long time. "Hey there," Jake called softly, not wanting to startle her awake. He kept his distance, recognizing the defensive posture even in sleep. She'd positioned herself where she could see both the door and the back exit, with the feed bins providing cover. The girl's eyes snapped open instantly, dark brown, almost black, alert and filled with a wariness that spoke of hard experience and broken trust. She scrambled to her feet with surprising grace, pressing herself against the stable wall like a cornered animal. Her breathing was quick and shallow, and Jake could see her muscles tensed for flight. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying a slight accent that Jake couldn't quite place. "I didn't think anyone would find me. I'll leave right now." Jake raised his hands in a peaceful gesture, the same way he'd approach a spooked horse. "Hold on now. You don't need to run. Are you hurt? When's the last time you ate something?" He could see the exhaustion in every line of her posture, the way her clothes hung loose on her thin frame, the hollow look in her cheeks that spoke of too many missed meals. The girl's dark eyes darted toward the door, calculating her escape route with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd had to run before. "I'm fine. Just needed a place to sleep for a few hours. I'll be gone, I promise." "What's your name, sweetheart?" Jake asked, keeping his voice gentle and non-threatening. He'd spent enough time with frightened animals to know that sudden movements or loud voices would only make things worse. After a long pause, during which Jake could practically see her weighing whether to lie or tell the truth, she answered, "Maria. Maria B. Gay." Jake nodded slowly, recognizing the surname from his years living in Arizona. "You're Apache." It wasn't a question. He'd learned enough about the local tribes to recognize the name and the strong, distinctive features that marked her heritage. Maria's chin lifted slightly, and for a moment, a flash of fierce pride cut through her fear. "Chiricahua Apache," she said, and Jake heard the weight of history and tradition in those words. "Well, Maria Begay," Jake said, turning slightly toward the door, but keeping his movements slow and predictable. "I'm Jake Morrison, and this is my ranch. How about we get you something to eat and figure out what's going on? I've got eggs, bacon, and fresh coffee in the kitchen. When's the last time you had a hot meal?" Maria's stomach chose that moment to growl audibly, betraying her claim that she was fine. A flush of embarrassment colored her cheeks, but she didn't move from her position against the wall. "I can't pay you," she said quietly. "Did I ask you to?" Jake replied gently. "Look, I don't know what's going on or why you're sleeping in my stable, but I know hungry when I see it, and I know scared when I see it too. You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to, but you should eat something." For a long moment, Maria didn't move. Jake could see the internal struggle playing out across her face, the desperate need for food and safety warring with whatever had taught her not to trust adults. Finally, as if making a decision that would change everything, she took a tentative step forward. Just breakfast?" she asked, her voice small. "Just breakfast," Jake confirmed. "And then, if you want to keep moving, that's your choice. But at least you'll have a full belly when you do." As they walked toward the main house, Jake noticed how Maria kept glancing over her shoulder, how she positioned herself so she could see all the exits, how her hand never strayed far from the small backpack she carried. Whatever had brought her to his stable, it had taught her to be constantly ready to run. And Jake Morrison, who had spent 4 years learning to live with loneliness, suddenly found himself hoping she wouldn't. The kitchen of Jake's ranch house had always been Sarah's domain, and he'd barely changed it since her passing. The same blue gingham curtains hung at the windows, the same ceramic rooster collection lined the windowsill, and the same heavy oak table where they had shared thousands of meals still dominated the center of the room. Now, as Jake prepared breakfast for an unexpected guest, the kitchen felt alive again, in a way that both comforted and unsettled him. Maria sat at the far end of the table, positioned so she could see both the front door and the back exit, a detail that didn't escape Jake's notice. She held her coffee mug with both hands, as if drawing warmth from it, and Jake noticed the way her fingers trembled slightly. Whether from cold, hunger, or fear, he couldn't tell. When Jake set the plate in front of her, 3 scrambled eggs cooked in butter, 4 strips of thick-cut bacon, and 2 pieces of toast with homemade strawberry jam, Maria's eyes widened. For a moment, she just stared at the food, as if she couldn't quite believe it was real. "Go ahead," Jake said gently, settling into his own chair with his coffee. "It's not going anywhere." Maria picked up the fork with careful deliberation and took a small bite of eggs, then another. Then she began eating with the focused intensity of someone who hadn't had a proper meal in far too long. Jake pretended to read the local newspaper, giving her privacy while keeping an eye on her from his peripheral vision. The girl was practically inhaling the food, but trying to maintain some dignity while doing it. "When's the last time you ate?" Jake asked quietly, not looking up from his paper. Maria paused mid-bite. "Day before yesterday. Found some vending machine crackers at a gas station." Jake's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "And before that?" "I don't know. Time kind of blurs together when you're running." She took another bite of toast, closing her eyes briefly as if savoring the simple pleasure of homemade jam. "This is really good. Did you make the jam?" "My wife did. Made it last summer before." Jake trailed off, then cleared his throat. "She always made extra. Gave jars to the neighbors, entered it in the county fair, won first place 3 years running." Maria's eating slowed slightly. "She's not here anymore? Cancer took her 4 years ago." Jake folded the newspaper, setting it aside. "It's just been me and the animals since then." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the ticking of the old wall clock and the distant lowing of cattle. Jake found himself studying Maria's face in the morning light streaming through the window. She had high cheekbones and strong features that spoke of Apache heritage. But there was something else there too, a premature gravity, a wariness that no teenager should have to carry. "I've been living on the San Carlos Apache Reservation," Maria said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "With my grandmother, my parents died in a car accident 3 years ago. Drunk driver hit them head on, coming home from my cousin's wedding in Globe." Jake set down his coffee cup. "I'm sorry. Grandma Rose tried her best, but..." Maria pushed eggs around on her plate. "The reservation isn't easy. Not enough jobs, not enough money, not enough help for people who need it. She was already struggling when my parents died, and suddenly she had a 13-year-old to take care of." "That's a lot for anyone to handle," Jake said carefully. Maria nodded, her dark eyes distant. "She worked at the tribal clinic as a receptionist, but it was only part-time. We lived in this old single-wide trailer that leaked when it rained and had no insulation. In winter, we'd huddle around the space heater and wear our coats inside." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "But she made sure I went to school, made sure I had food, even when she didn't eat much herself. She was proud, you know. Apache women are strong. She used to tell me stories about our ancestors, about how they survived when the whole world was against them." Jake waited, sensing there was more to come. "But last month, she got really sick. Diabetes, she'd had it for years, but couldn't always afford her medication. Sometimes she'd skip doses to save money, or she'd split pills to make them last longer." Maria's voice cracked. Her feet started turning black. "The clinic said she needed to go to the hospital in Phoenix, maybe lose some toes, but she didn't have insurance that would cover it. The Indian Health Service has waiting lists months long for anything serious." The weight of systemic poverty and inadequate health care hung heavy in the air between them. Jake had heard about these issues, but had never seen them up close, never had to confront the reality of someone choosing between medication and food. "She got desperate," Maria continued, staring into her now empty coffee cup. "Really desperate. I came home from school one day, and there was this man sitting in our living room, big guy, maybe 40, with a fancy truck and expensive boots. He said his name was Curtis, that he was a horse trader from Texas." Jake felt his stomach begin to clench. "He had this saddle with him, the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. Hand-tooled leather with silver conchos, turquoise inlay, the works. Must have been worth maybe $4,000. He set it right there on our kitchen table like it was some kind of treasure." Maria's voice became hollow. "He told my grandmother he'd heard she was having trouble, that he might be able to help." "What kind of help?" Jake asked, though he was beginning to fear the answer. Maria was quiet for so long that Jake wondered if she was going to continue. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "He said he knew a family in Phoenix. Rich family? Said they'd been looking to adopt a Native American girl, that they wanted to honor their connection to the land by raising someone from the original people. He made it sound noble, like they were going to give me opportunities, send me to college, treat me like their own daughter." Jake's hands slowly clenched into fists under the table. "And in exchange," Maria continued, tears now streaming down her cheeks, "he'd give my grandmother the saddle. She could sell it, pay for her medical treatment, maybe have enough left over to fix the trailer roof. He said it was a win-win situation. I'd get a better life, and she'd get the help she needed." "Maria," Jake started, but she held up her hand. "She was dying, Mr. Morrison. Sitting there at our kitchen table with her feet wrapped in bandages, smelling like infection and fear. She looked at me with these eyes full of love and desperation, and she said, 'Misha, maybe this is a blessing. Maybe the Creator is sending you a better path.'" Maria wiped her face with the back of her hand. "She thought she was saving me." The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of desperation and misguided love. Jake reached across the table and gently placed his weathered hand over Maria's smaller one. "What happened when you got to Phoenix?" Maria's laugh was bitter and broken. "There was no family. Curtis drove me to this house in a rundown neighborhood, and there were other men there, and other girls. Girls who looked like they'd given up hope a long time ago." She pulled her hand away, wrapping her arms around herself. "I realized pretty quick what was really going on, what they really wanted from me." Jake's vision went red around the edges. In his 40-plus years on Earth, he'd never felt such a pure, burning rage. "How did you get away?" "I got lucky. Second day there, Curtis had to drive to Tucson for something, probably to find more girls. I was in the car with him, and when he stopped for gas, I told him I needed to use the bathroom. Instead, I ran through the gas station, through the parking lot, down the street. I could hear him yelling behind me, but I kept running. That was 3 days ago? Maria nodded. I've been walking ever since, staying off the main roads, sleeping wherever I could find shelter. I knew if I went back to the reservation, he'd find me there, and I couldn't go to the police because... She trailed off. Because what? Because people like me, Mr. Morrison, we disappear into the system. Foster homes where nobody knows our culture, group homes where we're just another problem to manage. I've seen it happen to kids from the reservation. They go into the system and come out broken, if they come out at all. Maria's voice was fierce now, filled with a determination that reminded Jake of his late wife. I won't let that happen to me. Jake studied her face, seeing not just the frightened girl who'd been sleeping in his stable, but a young woman with incredible strength and survival instincts. Then, what do you want to do? Maria was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the desert landscape. I want to go home. I want to bury my grandmother properly. I don't even know if anyone found her body yet. I want to say goodbye the right way, with the ceremonies our people deserve. And then, she paused. Then I want to figure out how to build a life that honors what she tried to do for me, even if she went about it wrong. Jake felt something shift in his chest, a stirring of purpose he hadn't felt in years. That's going to take help, and it's going to take time. I know. Maria looked at him with eyes that held both hope and wariness. The question is, are you willing to help someone like me? Really help, not just give me breakfast and send me on my way. Jake Morrison looked at this brave, broken girl sitting at his wife's table, eating food from his wife's dishes, and felt Sarah's presence as clearly as if she were standing beside him, whispering in his ear. Help her, he could almost hear her say. She's why you're still here. Maria, he said quietly, I think we need to make some phone calls. The first phone call Jake made was to his neighbor Tom Rodriguez, a retired Pima County sheriff who'd become his closest friend after Sarah's death. Tom arrived within an hour, his weathered face serious as he listened to Maria's story over a second pot of coffee. Unlike Jake's initial shock and rage, Tom's reaction was methodical. He took notes, asked careful questions, and made phone calls to contacts in law enforcement and victim services. We're going to handle this right, Tom assured Maria, his voice gentle but authoritative. There are people who specialize in these situations, people who understand both the legal aspects and the cultural sensitivity required, but it's going to take time to set everything in motion. That's how Maria ended up staying at the ranch for what was supposed to be just a few days while Tom worked his contacts. Those few days stretched into a week, then 2, as the investigation began and proper protocols were established. And in that time, something neither Jake nor Maria had expected began to happen. They started to heal each other. The transformation began in the stables. On her third morning at the ranch, Jake found Maria already there ahead of him, sitting cross-legged in the hay near Ranger's stall. The old gelding, usually standoffish with strangers, had his massive head hanging over the gate, eyes half closed in contentment as Maria spoke to him in soft Apache. He likes you, Jake observed, impressed despite himself. Ranger had been Sarah's favorite, and since her death, the horse had been withdrawn and difficult to handle. Maria looked up, a slight flush coloring her cheeks. I was just talking to him. My grandfather taught me that horses understand more than people think. They carry the stories we tell them. What stories are you telling him? About my grandmother, about the mountains where she was born, about the old days when our people moved freely across this land. Maria stood, brushing hay from her jeans. Horses remember things, even when people forget. Jake found himself studying this girl, who seemed to carry so much wisdom despite her youth. Your grandfather sounds like he was quite a teacher. He was, Joseph Biquet. Everyone called him Grandfather Joe. He worked with horses his whole life, trained them for ranchers all over Arizona and New Mexico. He said horses and people aren't so different. Both need to trust before they can be healed. Maria approached Ranger's stall, and the big horse immediately pushed his nose toward her hand. He passed when I was 12, but I remember everything he taught me. That morning, Jake made a decision that surprised even him. Want to help me with the morning routine? I could use an extra pair of hands. What followed was the beginning of a partnership that transformed both the ranch and the people on it. Maria proved to have an almost supernatural connection with the animals. She could calm the most skittish mare with just her voice, could spot signs of illness or injury that Jake might have missed, and had an intuitive understanding of each horse's personality and needs. "Watch this," Jake said one afternoon, leading out Bella, a young quarter horse who'd been traumatized by her previous owner and had been nearly impossible to saddle. "She hasn't let anyone get a saddle on her in 6 months. Maria approached Bella slowly, her movements fluid and non-threatening. She began speaking in Apache, her voice low and melodic, and Jake watched in amazement as the horse's ears pricked forward with interest rather than flattening in fear. "What are you saying to her?" Jake asked quietly. "I'm telling her about the desert in spring, when the saguaros bloom and the whole world turns green. I'm telling her about freedom and open spaces and running with the wind." Maria's hand barely brushed Bella's neck, but the horse leaned into the touch. "Now I'm telling her that she's safe here, that no one will hurt her anymore." 20 minutes later, Bella stood calmly while Maria settled a saddle pad across her back. It was the first time in months the horse had allowed anyone to make progress with her training. "How did you do that?" Jake asked, genuinely awed. Maria shrugged, but Jake could see the pride in her eyes. "Grandfather Joe always said that broken things recognize each other. Bella knows I understand what it's like to be afraid." As the days passed, the ranch took on a rhythm it hadn't had since Sarah's death. Maria was up before dawn each morning, often beating Jake to the stables. She threw herself into the work with an intensity that spoke of both natural ability and desperate need for purpose. She mucked stalls, hauled feed, repaired fence lines, and gradually coaxed the more difficult horses back to health and trust. But it was the evenings that revealed the depth of the bond forming between them. After dinner, they would sit on the front porch watching the sun set over the Catalina Mountains, sharing stories that neither had told anyone else in years. "Sarah would have loved you," Jake said one evening, watching Maria braid leather strips into a makeshift halter. "She always said this place needed young energy to keep it alive." "Tell me about her," Maria requested, not looking up from her work. Jake found himself sharing memories he'd kept locked away since Sarah's death. He told Maria about how Sarah had insisted on naming every animal on the ranch, how she'd sung to the horses while she worked, how she'd dreamed of turning part of the property into a sanctuary for rescued animals. He talked about her garden, her terrible cooking, her fierce loyalty to the people she loved. "She sounds like my grandmother," Maria said softly. "Strong women who loved too much and worried about everyone but themselves." In return, Maria shared stories of life on the reservation that painted a picture of a community struggling but unbroken. She told Jake about traditional ceremonies, about the importance of the 4 sacred mountains to Apache culture, about her grandmother's work preserving traditional foods and medicines. She described the beauty of the high desert, the way the summer storms rolled across the mesas, the ancient petroglyphs hidden in remote canyons. "People think the reservation is just poverty and problems," Maria said one evening, watching lightning flicker on the distant horizon. "But it's also home. It's where our ancestors are buried, where our stories live in the landscape. You can't understand Apache people without understanding our connection to the land." Jake found himself learning not just about Apache culture, but about resilience, about finding strength in tradition, about the way communities could survive against impossible odds. Maria's stories challenged his assumptions and opened his eyes to experiences he'd never considered. But perhaps the most significant change was in how the ranch felt. The oppressive silence that had settled over the property after Sarah's death began to lift. There was laughter again, Maria's delighted giggle when one of the barn cats stalked her shoelaces, her satisfied chuckle when a difficult horse finally accepted her training. There were conversations during meals instead of Jake eating in solitude. There was music. Maria hummed traditional songs while she worked, filling the stables with melodies that seemed to calm both horses and humans. "I haven't heard singing in these stables in 4 years," Jake admitted one afternoon, finding Maria grooming Ranger while humming an Apache lullaby. "My grandmother used to say that silence isn't healing, it's just waiting. She said we have to fill the quiet spaces with good things, or the sadness moves in permanently." Maria looked up from her work. This place has been too quiet for too long. Jake felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of grief that he'd carried like a stone. You're probably right about that. 3 weeks into Maria's stay, Tom Rodriguez arrived with news. He'd made contact with FBI agent Sarah Hawk, a member of the White Mountain Apache tribe who specialized in crimes involving Native American victims. More importantly, he'd connected with Lucinda Ramon, a victim advocate who works specifically with trafficking survivors from the tribal communities. They want to meet with you tomorrow, Tom told Maria over dinner. Agent Hawk will handle the criminal investigation, and Ms. Ramon will help with the next steps, getting you back to San Carlos safely, connecting you with proper resources, making sure you have support. Jake watched Maria's face carefully as Tom spoke. He saw relief there, but also fear, and something that might have been sadness. That's good news, Maria said quietly. I need to go home. I need to take care of my grandmother's burial, deal with her belongings, figure out what comes next. What does come next? Jake asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Maria was quiet for a long moment. I don't know. I'll be 18 in 6 months, so I'll age out of any tribal youth services. I'll need to find work, find a place to live. Maybe I can get my GED, maybe even think about college eventually. She paused. I know I can't stay here forever. The words hung in the air between them, and Jake realized with a start that the thought of Maria leaving felt like losing Sarah all over again. But this time, instead of helpless grief, he felt something else, determination. Maria, he said carefully, I've been thinking. What you've done with the horses these past weeks, what you've brought to this place, it's extraordinary. I've been ranching for 30 years, and I've never seen anything like your natural ability. Maria looked up at him with curious eyes. The truth is, I've been thinking about expanding the operation. Maybe developing a program for therapeutic riding, or horse rescue and rehabilitation. It would take someone with your skills, someone who understands both horses and healing. Jake paused, his heart pounding. It would take a partner. Mr. Morrison, Maria began. Just think about it, Jake interrupted gently. I'm not saying you have to decide anything now. Go home, take care of what you need to take care of. But when you're ready, if you want a place to build something meaningful, to honor both your grandfather's teachings and your own gifts, the offer stands. That night, for the first time since Sarah's death, Jake didn't feel the crushing weight of solitude. The house felt alive with possibility, filled with the promise of purpose beyond his own grief. And Maria, lying in the guest room that had become hers, stared at the ceiling and imagined a future that had seemed impossible just weeks before. A future where being broken could lead to becoming whole, where helping heal could be a path to healing yourself. Outside, the desert wind carried the scent of sage and the distant sound of horses settling for the night, and both Jake and Maria found themselves hoping that tomorrow would bring not just answers, but the beginning of something neither had dared to dream. The drive to San Carlos took 3 hours, winding through desert landscapes that gradually gave way to the pine-covered mountains of the Apache homeland. Maria grew quieter as they approached the reservation, but Jake could sense her resolve strengthening. There, she pointed to a small trailer surrounded by a chain-link fence. That's home. The trailer showed signs of abandonment, overgrown weeds, a broken window hastily covered with cardboard. But Maria walked toward it with the dignity of someone returning to sacred ground. FBI agent Sarah Hawk, a member of the White Mountain Apache tribe whom Tom had recommended, met them there. She was professional but kind, understanding the delicate nature of the situation. We'll get the investigation started, Agent Hawk assured them. And I've spoken with the tribal social services. They have a program for young people aging out of difficult situations, job training, education support, housing assistance. As they stood in the small cemetery behind the local church, where Maria's grandmother had been buried in a simple ceremony, Jake felt the full weight of the journey they'd both taken. She would have been proud of you, he told Maria as she placed wildflowers on the grave, for surviving, for being strong enough to trust again. Maria wiped her eyes and looked at Jake. What will you do now? Go back to your ranch? Jake nodded, but for the first time, the thought of returning to solitude didn't feel like a retreat. I will, but I was thinking, The offer stands if you ever want to visit. Learn more about ranching. I could use help with the horses." Maria smiled, the first truly bright smile he'd seen from her. "I'd like that, Mr. Morrison. I'd like that very much." 6 months later, Maria did return to Jake's ranch, not as a frightened girl seeking shelter, but as a young woman with purpose. She enrolled in the agricultural program at Pima Community College and spent weekends helping Jake with the horses. The ranch came alive again with laughter and conversation, and Jake discovered that healing could be a shared journey. Sometimes, he reflected, the most profound rescues happen when two broken people decide to help each other become whole again. The end.